Hello everyone. In this session, we want to take a look at configuring domain user password policy. The domain user password policy applies to all users in the domain except where specific password setting objects have been assigned. Now, we were able to configure a single password policy and a single account lockout for an entire domain traditionally. But with Windows Server 2008, starting from Windows Server 2008, Microsoft introduced what we call a fine-grained password policy, which makes it possible to assign different policies to different sets of users within a domain. This type of policy can be set by using the graphical Active Directory Administrative Center or by using Powershell. We first want to start by looking at the traditional policy where you set a single password policy and a single account lockout for the entire domain. So let us go into Group Policy. So we're going to click on Tools, Group Policy Management. We want to expand our forest. Click to expand the domain, which is contoso.com. And we want to edit the default domain policy. When we edit this default domain policy, remember that whatever we set is going to be available for the entire domain. So we're going to right click on default domain policy and we want to click on edit. To find the password policy, we go through computer configuration, policies, Windows settings, security settings, account policies, and there we have it, password policy. So we're going to double click on password policy and we can see that there are 6 password policies. Enforced password history, maximum password age, minimum password age, minimum password length, password must meet complexity requirements, and store passwords using reversible encryption. We're going to go through these policies one by one. We're going to start off by looking at the first policy setting that we see here, enforce password history. So we're going to double click on that setting. And we see that we have 2 tabs, security policy setting, which is the settings section, and the explain tab. The policy is defined. We see that there's a tick to the left of define this policy setting. And we have here the default policy setting. On domain controllers, the default value for this setting is 24 passwords. On standalone servers, the default for this value is 0. This policy setting determines the number of unique new passwords that must be associated with a user account before an old password can be reused. There is the Explain tab. Let's click on the Explain tab. The Explain tab explains in detail about the enforced password history. So you can always go and click on the Explain tab to see exactly what that setting will do. Let us click on OK to close that setting. And we're going to go to the next setting, maximum password age. We're going to double click on maximum password age. And we see that the default value for this setting is 42 days. This policy determines the maximum number of days a password can be used before the user must change this password. Its value must be more than the minimum password age value. Again, we have the Explain tab. Let's click on it. And you have a full explanation of the maximum password age. The user specified number of days can be between 0 and 999. And again, the default for this setting is 42. Let's click on OK and move on to the next setting, which is the minimum password age. Let's double click on minimum password age. And this policy setting determines the minimum number of days that a password must be used before the user is allowed to change it. Its value must be less than the minimum password, must be less, not than the minimum, must be less than the maximum password age. Its value must be less than the maximum password age value. You want to configure this policy setting to a number that is greater than 0 and set enforce password history setting to make this setting effective. If you configure the enforce password history setting to 0, then users are not required to choose a new unique password when prompted to change their password. If password history is used, users must enter a new unique password when they change their passwords. The possible values, you have user specified number of days between 0 and 998. Notice that the default value for this setting is 1 on domain controllers and 0 on standalone servers. Again, we have our Explain tab where you can go through the explanation for the minimum password age. Let's click OK and move on to the next setting, which is the minimum password length. This policy setting determines the fewest number of characters that can make up a password for a user's account. Some prefer using a passphrase rather than a password. For example, you can use a phrase. Such a phrase is stronger than an 8 or 10 character setting, and sometimes it's easier to remember. Of course, it's longer to type in. The longer a password is, the better security it provides, especially if it includes a character combination of probably upper and lowercase letters, digits, symbols, and punctuations. In most environments, I would recommend an 8-character password because it is long enough to provide adequate security but not too difficult for users to easily remember. So this configuration will provide adequate defense against what we call a brute force attack, where people try to guess and guess and guess and guess your password until they figure it out. Using the password must meet complexity requirements setting in addition to the minimum password length setting helps reduce the possibility of what we call a dictionary attack, where the user goes through as many words as he can trying to figure out what your password is. Again, we have the Explain tab that explains this policy for us. Let's go to the next policy by clicking on OK, our next setting, and it is store passwords using reversible encryption, and you see that that is disabled by default. Let's double click on it. Now, the store password using reversible encryption for all users in the domain setting provides support for application protocols that require knowledge of the user's password for authentication purposes. However, you are warned that encrypted passwords that are stored in this way by using that store reversible encryption option can be potentially dangerous because it can be decrypted by an attacker that gets hold of the encrypted version and is able to find the encryption key. So you only use this if you have to. As you can see, it is disabled by default. Again, you have the Explain tab, and the Explain tab carries you through the explanation for that store password using reversible encryption. And again, it tells you that the policy provides support for applications that use protocols that require knowledge of the user's password for authentication purposes. This policy should never be enabled unless application requirements outweigh the need to protect password information. It is also possible for us to set the default domain password policy by using Windows PowerShell. To do that, we use the commandlet set-ad default domain password policy. For example, to set the default domain password policy to a minimum of 10 characters without changing other policies, we can use get-ad default domain password policy, the pipe key, and then type set-ad default domain password policy hyphen min, standing for minimum, password length 10. So remember the PowerShell commandlet to set the password policy is set-ad default domain password policy. If we had to set a policy, we first would type get-ad default domain password policy. Then we put in the pipe key, and after the pipe key, we use the set-ad default domain password policy with the min password length parameter and then the value for the password length. In this session, we took a look at the default user domain password policy settings. We looked at how we will find them. We looked at the explanation for each one. And we also reminded you that we can set the default domain password policy by using the Windows PowerShell command set-ad default domain password policy commandlet. This is the end of our session, and I want to thank you for listening.